Welcome back to the Sounds of the Baskerville, Season 3. How are you, Chris?
Good, thanks, James. Good to be back, 2023.
2023. So thanks to all of those who have followed us over the last couple of years. Chris, we've got a 100% increase in our listenership. It's not just members of our families.
Amazing.
It's great. It's probably a bit like something I wouldn't mind raising today, which is this recent ASIC report about small business reconstruction.
Yeah.
And so bear with us, dear listener. It's quite interesting. So one of the bits of feedback we have had is about just making sure and that just to stick to what are the take-homes we want business people to learn when we talk about the 2,000 case studies that you've been involved in, Chris, over the years about turning your business around or finding the best outcome for stakeholders that you possibly can from sometimes the ruins. But my new favourite subject is these small business reconstructions. You've highlighted a report that the regulators come out with a kind of a what's going on so far and what the business people need to know. Is that the sort of the vibe from your perspective?
Yeah. So this small business restructuring, as we sit here doing this podcast with a growth of 100% in our listenership, it's 2 years old. So in other words, legislation and this concept kicked in January 2 years ago. And so we're 2 years down the track. And ASIC has recently published data going back to the closing off at 30 June 2022. So in other words, what does the first 18 months of our new little legislative baby look like? And is it effective? That's what they're trying to answer the question. And they've been able to analyse because there's a lot of documents that do need to be lodged with ASIC through the journey. And there's a lot of data they're actually capturing from guys like us. And they even get copies of all the reports that help them try and assess, is this new legislation effective? Is it helping viable businesses survive? Are the right people getting the assistance that they need? And this is their first snapshot of that.
And we've talked about this before. I mean, I was on record. I am interested in this legislation where the internet can forget you. Wouldn't mind forget. I was pretty sceptical of this legislation when it was first presented. But what we have talked over previous shows is it really gives you, with your experience, the opportunity to work with the director as a ASIC might describe them, an agent of them to try and help them through a process to present a plan to creditors to find a way forward.
That's one of the unique things about a small business restructuring is you need to have effectively a registered liquidator to be the small business restructuring practitioner, or you have to hold a registration specifically for small business restructuring. And I think this data shows there's at least one person out there that holds just a small business restructuring qualification per ASIC, but a registered liquidator is always able to help. And the data goes through, the looking at 82, I think, companies that have used small business restructuring. But you're right, James, going back to your earlier comment, it started off as a low base in 2021. I think we're looking at data here from GM Advisory, and there's only 22 plans that got approved in 2021. But in 2022, that really accelerates up to about 130 odd companies. So in other words, massive growth percentage, I think 600 odd percent.
But it's funny though, it's still not a huge number of even companies. If you look at the stats that ASIC could put out, there's still quite a small number relative to, say, all of the liquidations that might go on or deregistration. So it's still relatively small but growing fast. Is that the stat?
Yes, I think that's what we're going to be looking at. So if we take the rule of thumb, if you go back to when ASIC started recording data back in, I think it was 1999, when the Companies Act of each state amalgamated into one Commonwealth piece of legislation, and then they started capturing those statistics. On average, 10,000 companies per year go into some version of external administration, right? 10,000, rule of just on average. And so, we're only talking less than 200 companies enjoying the benefits of small business restructuring, but the growth is suggesting that a lot of that 10,000 is going to be, this small business restructuring is going to be increasing as a percentage of the types of external administration that are out there.
So let's have a look maybe into some of these stats and maybe some of the feedback. There was some overall observations that ASIC had made, one of which was that they had some feedback about the hoops being a little hard to jump through to get into it at the front end, weren't they? So they were talking, you've got to be substantially compliant, don't you, with your tax obligations to get into this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ATO is definitely pressing the companies to file their company tax returns earlier than when you're actually obligated if you didn't appoint a small business restructuring. As an example, ordinarily, if you've got a tax agent, you can lodge your company tax return in March or May of this year. But if you do a small business restructuring, the ATO wants your tax return done in 2 days. In other words, lodge your 2022 tax return in the month of January, even though it's not due until March or May, because they want to absolutely be very, very clear that this is exactly the dollar value that we are looking to compromise.
And so certainly the feedback that we've had from various ones that you and I have seen or others is that the tax office are asking for a lot of stuff.
And the data does show in 80% of the small business restructuring, the ATO is a creditor. And in the greater majority of those, they are the most influential creditor. In other words, if the ATO says yes, you get your small business restructuring plan up. If they say no, you fail.
And if it's some of the ones that you and I've seen together, I mean, 1 or 2 where the tax office wasn't the main creditor, most of them have been to do with tax, haven't they?
Yeah, there's a small percentage, I think it was less than 10% according to this ASIC report, where there was no presence of the ATO for a small business restructuring. So it's not saying that the ATO is 100%, but they are certainly the featured creditor in the greater majority of all small business restructuring.
And I suppose if you're thinking about it as a perspective of a taxpayer, you'd want the taxman to be fairly sure that he or she was getting all the facts. So the tax office is certainly asking for. There's an important point to raise here. So that's to go into the process, you need to be substantially compliant. So you need to get some proper professional advice. And if you're not quite there yet, that doesn't mean the door is always closed. You can get people, some of the work that I've been doing is getting people ready to be substantially compliant, obviously. But you need to have a liquidator involved or somebody who knows what they're doing. Don't go to diysbr.com.au or something like that. You need to speak to somebody who knows what they're doing.
Absolutely. And you're right, James, not all companies are. Let's say a director wakes up today and goes, man, I'm feeling the pinch of my business. I've heard about this small business restructure. I hear the eligibility is I'd need total debts less than $1 million. And they're going through the mental arithmetic, yep, tick, tick, tick. But maybe they haven't quite squared away employee entitlements. And maybe they have a couple of outstanding tax returns due to be lodged. Well, they probably need a little bit of prep work to get them squared away so that when we go, we're on and we're not wasting time trying to piece together all these puzzles while we're in the heat of this very critical 20 business days to get a proposal out to creditors.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you only have 20 days once you press go. Hey,
once you press go, you got 20 business days.
You can kind of extend it. You know, you've got to have most of the work done, really, don't you? You can't sort of sit there and say, oh, by the way.
Yeah, you don't.
The clock's ticking.
Put it this way, you don't want to get to the 19th business day and go, oh, geez, I better do something about this. And you are right. The legislation does allow for an extension. I think it's 5 business days and you can have multiple extensions.
Yeah, but just don't rely on it.
No, because, creditors are sitting there and going, okay, we're in this pause period. We're in a bit of limbo. We're waiting to see this plan. What does it look like? Could the plan be improved by the director? But yeah, you don't want to drag it out because the more you keep asking for extensions, the more it equals the reduction in sort of goodwill of your creditors.
Gotcha. So that's a good point. So what are the creditors? Is this in this report? What are the kind of the things that you think people need to do or know? There's kind of 3 things from the ones you've done.
So my colleagues and I in our firm, because this is such a new ground that we're all traversing, and some of my colleagues have actually done a lot more SBRs than I, but we are sharing information because we all want this to be successful. And we have been able to digest that there's 3 key things that are rolling through creditors' heads when they're assessing a small business restructuring. And again, you won't find this in the ASIC report. I think, what was the number? Report 756 from the Australian Securities Investment Commission for those playing at home. So creditors need to ask themselves this: is there an extraordinary event that has put the company into this position? And let's just reflect. It could be bushfires, flooding, COVID, cyclones. Is there something extraordinary that has put the company in this position? Is the business viable moving forward? So in other words, we've drawn the line in the sand today. Is the business viable moving forward? In other words, is it profitable? Is it got good cash flow? moving forward. We recognize there's a legacy debt we need to address, and that's the whole reason for SBR, but is it viable moving forward? And the third thing that runs through creditors' heads here is there a better outcome in small business restructuring when compared to putting a liquidator in and just vaporizing the entire business?
There's some great stats in here, which supports obviously what you've said. If there's lots of them, so like 54 in this case and 36 where there was sort of 1 to 2 creditors. So mostly it's the tax office and maybe 1 or 2 others. So there's a few people you've got to convince and you've got to have a pretty good story.
Well, that's right. I think there was only maybe 10% where the ATO was not a creditor. So you've always got to consider the ATO being a very significant stakeholder.
So, okay, what are the debts? Did you see in this, what are the debts for the sort of the average debt that was due?
Yeah, I think the median they were talking about here, well, they always talk about a range, but it's 200,000 to 600,000 seems to be where the majority of the debt burden is for a small business. Yeah. And it looks like from the data that we're getting is the average return to creditors using SBR, where the medium is somewhere between 15 cents and 30 cents in the dollar. And I think that's really good for people to understand is you might have a debt burden of $1 million, but the small business restructuring could help you just pay somewhere between 15 and 30 cents in the dollar and your business still lives.
Not an interesting conversation with a person yesterday. There's a whole lot of things. We're going to get Patrick Coughlin's going to come in March and talk to us one of our vodcasts. We'll talk to him about what appears on your credit report and that sort of stuff for these sorts of things.
That's a good question to ask.
But if you're going to borrow money to pay a tax, got to file business, you can negotiate a story. What are you paying for? Can you continue to employ people? Because that's one of the things that they wanted. They were, how many people are you employing? What's the reasons to keep this business going? If you're going to pay this tax debt, how much are you going to have to pay yourself? How much are you going to go to the tax man and say, I'll do it out of future profits? Are you seeing any evolution in that from what you see at ASIC? And how much is the tax man going to ask the director to pay themselves? Are you seeing anything like that?
Yeah, well, I think the ATO does take a commercial mindset to it. In other words, a director in business that is seeking a profit to benefit their future has to be paid something to stay in the chair, to stay motivated, to keep the business going. And a director has to be rewarded for the risk they take on in business. That's a commercial understanding. You can't go to a director and say, hey, we expect you to pay yourselves $0, but for the next 3 years, make sure the ATO gets its share of the money. Because, at some point in time, the director burns out because they go, well, why am I doing this? What's the upside? So it has to be some commercial realism there. I do believe that the ATO does like to see, and even creditors generally like to see that, as we say anecdotally or colloquially, that a bit of bark has to come off the director. In other words, if the director reached into their own personal wealth to cause a contribution for the small business restructuring, I think creditors like to see that because that is the director showing bona fide. I believe in the business enough, and I believe if I get this compromise, we can live again and actually be quite successful. I'm going to tip in some of my personal wealth to make that happen.
So I think in terms of what we see moving forward, we see most of these, it's trying to give the stat, almost all the plans were approved. High level of approval.
92% approval rate for small business restructuring.
And most of them either were executed or are ongoing. There's been a bunch didn't go through, still killed off halfway through or
not eligible to begin with, or just creditors just rejected the plan.
But from a business perspective, in terms of the risk, we're talking about if you can get yourself reasonably compliant. And certainly a conversation I've had with a few directors is getting your decks cleaned up. You're getting a really good insight to your business. You've actually got yourself, this exercise actually cleans you up, ready to fight another day.
Yeah.
So,
understand your business.
Understand your business, and so it forces you to get a handle on it because you've got to tell the tax man the tax person, why you deserve another chance.
And what are you going to do in future to make sure this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, and if you do, you'll get a fair hearing. That's the bottom line here, isn't it? And there's guys like you who've seen it all before who can help you get there. Something I'm helping people with, just to get to talk to people like you.
Yeah.
How do you distill that knowledge. So this small business reconstruction, which I kind of poo-pooed, the curve is there's a J curve going on here to quote the man. And it's a bit like our listenership numbers. They're increasing. I do think there's a few people who've had a go. There's a few people more like you who've done few. So once you've done a few, I think you get your feet under the desk, you get a sense for how these things are going to roll.
Yeah. And just for the disclosure for listenership here, is not all the SBRs I've run have been successful. And there's a lot of learning lessons into why were they not successful. And I think that helps being a practitioner that has seen the successful ones get up and the unsuccessful ones not, but understanding why they haven't gotten up. I wanted to get runs on the board, and this is in the early days of this new system. And the director asked me, how many of these have you run? And I said, I've run one. And he goes, oh, how did it go? I said, it failed. Now, I had to be honest with the guy and say it failed, but I believe it failed because of these reasons. What I see in your case is you almost tick every single box you could possibly tick as to an eligible candidate. I think you've got what it's designed for. He then takes my phone call chat with him and goes talk to another insolvency practitioner who had done zero, but they were a bit wishy-washy about the advice to him. And he's come back to me and gone, I appreciate your honesty. You told me that you had one unsuccessful one, but you knew where it all failed. I'm running with you. So in a way, honesty was the best policy in that scenario. And the beautiful part is exactly what I said to him came true, which is he was a candidate. He got his small business restructuring up. But not only that, we also designed the plan so that he could get out of small business restructuring within about 30 or 40 days. So in other words, it wasn't even a long period of time. Yeah, because we said to him, can you make these certain lump sum payments come in from whatever source that you're going to dip into? And if you can make it happen in that short period of time, we're going to be in and out real quick. And we got that result for him.
But we're not talking kind of sheep stations in terms of contributions here. So maybe the contributions, what are you seeing in the ASIC report from the contributions?
Yeah, the median. So median being, if you take the outlier statistics on each end of the spectrum, in other words, the really, really bad spectrum and the really, really good part, the median, when you just look at that, the contribution directors make or the business makes to succeed in their SBR is somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000 to restructure their small business. So again, that amount of money could easily come from future trading profits, or people may just have that equity in their home that they can just quickly...
Or some combination.
Okay.
And I'm interested to see whether it goes more to personal contribution or stays with future profits. I've been mainly involved in future profit ones.
Yep.
And so the thing that's really interesting, though, is that contributions of sort of 15 to 30 cents dollars up to, say, kind of 50 grand to 200,000. It was about 48% for that particular group. And obviously you've got to have debts less than $1 million. So you've done one for debts just to very close to $1 million, which was a little tense.
It was because the outlier sometimes, if you think your debt burden, if you look at your balance sheet, you've got like $999,000 or whatever, the outlier is you're going to have creditors in your pool that don't quite assess their debt until the SBR comes in and then it draws a line in the sand. So you could have overestimated your creditors or underestimated, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah, so there's a fair bit in this, but so really interesting report from ASIC. It's worth the read. I think from a business perspective, if you're not, don't despair. You can still have conversations with people, but getting yourself fighting fit to give yourself to fight another day is a really good chance to use some of that 2000 case studies experience of Chris Baskerville of The Hound. Next week, we've got Piers Carstensen talking to us from a family law perspective, also timely around this time of year, sadly. And then coming out later in March, we'll, of course, have Patrick coming from Creditor Watch. It'll be interesting to hear about him. And so listening to Season 3, welcome back. Thanks, Chris.
James.
See ya.
Bye.
A reminder that these podcasts are general in nature and do not constitute advice, and they don't take into account your personal circumstances. So if you think, though, that some of the issues raised might apply to you, you should seek qualified financial, legal or counselling advice.